Thank you, Dina, for your kind words. It is an ancient tradition in Tel Aviv that between the hours of 3 and 4 is a Schlafstunde, so I will do my best not to disturb the slumbers of anyone in the audience. Dina mentioned the origins of the terms. I'm going to refer to the origins of the ideas behind reparations. There are many parents of the innovative ideas behind the campaign to obtain individual indemnification, restitution, and general reparations for the Jewish world from the German government. But it is generally recognized that the single indispensable expert on the subject, the man that made successful negotiations possible, was Nehemiah Robinson. Nehemiah Robinson was born in Lithuania in 1898. He studied law and political science in Germany, practiced law in Kovno from 1927. His older brother, Jacob, with whom Nehemiah practiced law, was a prominent legal counsel and activist in Jewish affairs. Jacob Robinson had been a member of the Lithuanian parliament as leader of the Jewish faction and of the minorities bloc. He was also a legal advisor to the Lithuanian government on matters relating to international law. And I might add that he's considered to be something of a national hero today in Lithuania because of his contribution to Lithuania's diplomatic struggles. They together fled Lithuania in 1940 and arrived later that year in New York. The elder brother's extensive experience in international and Jewish affairs enabled him to establish the Institute for Jewish Affairs in New York as part of the World Jewish Congress in February 1941. Nehemiah joined the Institute soon after it was created, and when Jacob, his older brother, later resigned to become legal advisor to the Jewish Agency mission to the United Nations in 1947, Nehemiah replaced him as the head of the Institute. He held that position until his death in 1964. The Institute was created after a gestation of almost 2 years. It had originally been planned for Geneva in 1939 by the World Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Congress. Originally, it was hoped that the Institute would serve all the leading Jewish organizations worldwide, including the British Board of Deputies and the Alliance Israélite Universelle, as well as major American Jewish organizations. However, the exigencies of war excluded cooperation of the non-American organizations, while political opposition to the articulation of separate collective Jewish rights and demands prevented the important American Jewish Committee from cooperating. In fact, 2 years later, 1943, the American Jewish Committee created its own competing research group intended to define Jewish needs in the post-war world, as did the Jewish Labor Committee. Similar think tank policy research institutions were established later on by the British branch of the World Jewish Congress, with the justification that only the British section could be in daily contact with the Allied governments in exile in London, and by the British Board of Deputies in 1943, and also by the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem. Refugee lawyers and scholars played a central role in each of these new institutions. Without detracting from their serious intent, the employment of these displaced lawyers and scholars was another impetus for creating these institutions. At its height, the New York Institute of Jewish Affairs alone employed 82 people. In part, the creation in wartime of so many policy centers aligned with the major Jewish organizations was a reflection of the massive scope of the catastrophe facing the Jewish world. It was also part of the zeitgeist. By 1944, there were over 200 non-governmental centers and think tanks engaged in post-war policy planning in the United States alone. Many of them had direct links to Washington and to the predecessor of the early American intelligence agencies, the Office of Strategic Services, the Joint being a classic case. And they were able to have an impact on the evolution of official thinking. Although the Institute of Jewish Affairs did not enjoy easy access to official Washington, it was a key part of a dialogue between the leading Jewish organizations in New York, London, and Jerusalem during the war years and after. The purpose of the Institute was to pursue the international protection of Jewish rights by formulating those rights, presenting them to the Allied governments and international forums, and working to ensure that they be included in a future peace settlement. In its own account of the history of the work of the Institute, this task was described as the elaboration of a Jewish peace program to be presented before the peace conferences at the end of hostilities. This was an ambitious project and was premised on the assumption that the Allied governments would not only be willing to recognize the existence of Jewish peoplehood and allow access of the Jewish people, represented of course by the World Jewish Congress, to its deliberations, but would also be willing to acknowledge the existence of idiosyncratic demands, specific Jewish demands on behalf of that group. However, there was considerable resistance to these assumptions at the highest level of the Allied governments and armies. There were many reasons for the generalized refusal to consider Jewish collective interests on the part of the major powers and international organizations that would be responsible for the administration of European countries once they had been liberated from German occupation. And I'm referring to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the Red Cross, the strategic headquarters of the Allies, amongst others. Nazism had discredited any focus on Jewish collective uniqueness, and the liberal humanist response to Nazi anti-Semitism was to deny the otherness or special needs of the Jews as a group. British policy, driven by its concerns in Palestine and its growing hostility to Zionism and Jewish nationalism, strongly opposed any focus on the Jews as a national group. And in general, Allied policy, concerned to counter Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda directed at the Allied armies in the field and at Allied public opinion at home, suffering deprivation because of the war effort, they resisted any special attention to the Jews. Rebuffed from any pretensions of becoming, quote, the foreign office of the Jewish people, the Institute of Jewish Affairs increasingly found itself focusing on current Jewish distress, attempting to draw the attention of Allied governments to the war against the Jews being conducted in Europe. The focus shifted from Jews as a group with special needs after the war to Jews as distinct victims of German policy during the war, requiring immediate relief efforts and ameliorative policies. There is already an extensive literature on the gradual recognition by the Allies that the Jews as a group were unique victims of the war, and the realization that the Germans were pursuing a policy of genocide. However, there is almost no literature on the following phase, 1943 to 1945, when the Allies began to prepare for the liberation and the post-hostilities occupation of Europe. In fact, despite the Allied declaration on Nazi policy towards the Jews in December 1942, there was a generalized unwillingness to draw any policy conclusions from the acknowledged fact of genocide. Just as the Jewish organizations had to work hard to get international attention to the plight of the victims in the 1941-42 period, so they had to work hard to gain attention to the future needs of survivors in the Allied and international organization post-war planning process in the 43 to 45 period. The Institute of Jewish Affairs devoted itself to this frustrating but urgent task during the second half of the war. In January 1943, 18 Allied governments published the, I quote, Inter-Allied Declaration Against Acts of Dispossession Committed in Territories Under Enemy Occupation or Control. This was a policy statement promising to undo acts of despoliation committed by the Nazis. The declaration marked the beginning of serious governmental deliberations on the restoration, if possible, of the economic status quo ante in Europe after the war. This is not the same as payment of reparations, which was a separate set of deliberations. The task was recognized as hugely complex, technical, and problematic, and official post-war policy planners in Washington and London were open to ideas. Although it was widely recognized that the Jews had been major victims of Nazi asset stripping, it was considered that restitution to any specific community would be impossible, and that the needs of rehabilitating the massive civilian refugee problem that was anticipated for the post-war period was so large that restitution, including of Jewish assets, would be directed to the general refugee population, Jewish and non-Jewish. The Allied planners anticipated as many as 14 million refugees, and also anticipated that the needs of repatriating and resettling this population would be obviously massive. Restored Nazi loot, it was hoped, would go a long way to covering the bill. On the other hand, it was generally anticipated that there would be few Jews left alive in the Nazi camp system, and that Jewish needs would be minimal, at least in the areas to be liberated by the Western Allied armies. But as the American and British forces advanced, it became clear that these expectations were not only wrong, but almost the opposite of the expectations of the planners. The general refugee problem was much smaller than anticipated. People made their own way home, while between 70 to 100,000 Jews were still alive in the camps at the time of liberation. It was at this point that the thinking evolving in Jewish policy circles began to have an impact in Washington. Between 1943 and 1945, it appears that ideas flowed freely between Nehemiah Robinson in New York, Hugo Marx and George Weiss working in Britain, George Landau and Siegfried Moses in Palestine, Ernst Muntz of the American Jewish Committee. But pride of place must go to Nehemiah Robinson, who published in fall 1944 an exhaustive 275-page study of the legal opportunities for restitution, that is, return of property, and indemnification, that is, compensation to individuals, in each of the occupied countries in Europe and in Nazi Germany. This was supplemented by regular extended updates during 1945 and 46, and a series of occasional publications on the technical aspects of the subject in the years that followed. Robinson made an exhaustive analysis of the scope of Jewish economic losses and documented it extensively. His conclusion with these losses were between 8.25 and $8.6 billion. This is 1944. Multiply that by about 15 to get current values. The authoritativeness of his argument and the thoroughness of his documentation had an impact, and it was this set of figures that was first cited in all subsequent Jewish claims. Furthermore, all those working on Jewish future claims could agree on the following 9 recommendations that had emerged from the exchanges of ideas since 1943. And I'll list the 9 major ideas. 1, because the obvious sensitivity in Germany of restituting Aryanized Jewish property, no post-war German government would be able to implement such a policy, and the occupying Allied governments would have to impose the restitution of Jewish property in Germany. 2, the Allies would have limited influence on the governments of the liberated countries in Europe in legislating the restoration of Jewish property rights in those countries, and the Jewish world would have to bring whatever pressure it could directly on those governments. 3, heirless individual assets could not be allowed to accrue to the German state. 4, an international Jewish organization must be established to receive heirless private and communal assets, as well as any bulk settlements made by post-war governments in lieu of imposing compulsory restitution. Next, these assets would be used wherever Jewish needs were greatest and would not necessarily be used for the benefit of the community where the assets were located. Next, the assets would be used to rehabilitate survivors and communities. The assets would also be used to strengthen the Jewish national home in Palestine. And finally, beyond restitution and indemnification, the Jewish people had a claim for general reparations like other Allied nations. The potential of reversing Nazi plunder of Jewish assets and receiving compensation for assets that could not be restored quickly became a leading item in the post-war Jewish agenda. It had immense potential for restoring the rights of survivors, including their homes, businesses, and savings, for providing the material resources that would enable large-scale rehabilitation and resettlement projects, and for rebuilding the Jewish world. It would also provide huge prestige and a position of prominence for whichever Jewish organization navigated this issue through the labyrinth of Allied diplomacy. But these last 2 considerations opened a Pandora's box of problems for Jewish politics. The problems of reconstruction required that ideological decisions be taken. Were the survivors to be rehabilitated in Palestine or their communities rebuilt in Europe? This issue led to a furious debate of principle in late 1944 between the Jewish Agency and the World Jewish Congress, with a hapless Nachum Goldman caught in the middle. In late 1944, In late November 1944, the World Jewish Congress organized a conference held in Atlantic City which brought together the largest representation of Jewish communities since the outbreak of war. 40 communities, 269 delegates attended, including a delegation from recently liberated Paris. Behind the scenes of the public sessions and dramatic calls for justice to the Jewish people, the major players in restitution policy met to work out a strategy. Nehemiah Robinson was quickly recognized as a preeminent expert in the formulation of future Jewish claims. And for a brief moment, it appeared as if the World Jewish Congress might come into its own and lead the political campaign that lay ahead. The platform that had evolved on the restitution issue was for all practical purposes collectivist in nature and gave general Jewish interests priority over the interests of individuals or of specific communities from which restitution property would be forthcoming. This suited the ideology of the Congress and its vision of Jewish peoplehood perfectly. However, With the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, it quickly became apparent that the Congress ideology ran counter to the policies of the Allies and to their military forces now in occupied Europe. Although the United States forces in Germany allowed the Joint Distribution Committee increasing access and eventually management of the DP camps with Jewish survivors, and in December 1945 also allowed Jewish agency teams into the camps, the World Jewish Congress was actively excluded. The obvious reason for this exclusion was that the Congress's commitment to the idea of Jewish peoplehood ran counter to the policy of the British in Palestine and also found little sympathy in Washington. To the liberal imagination, it was perilously close to Nazi racial theory. Furthermore, the American civil administrators in Germany did not want any political groups stirring up trouble among the Jewish survivors. The Joint and the Jewish Agency were acceptable as social welfare agencies, but the Congress was excluded because its agenda was political representation rather than practical refugee relief. On consideration, this is surprising. The World Jewish Congress had run very effective relief and rescue operations during the war, and while it did not have the resources or infrastructure of either the Joint or the Agency, it did not have to be written off as a purely political organization quite so easily. I suspect that one of the reasons it was rejected has to do with its fundamentally non-American character. It was an international organization, and its leadership in New York were European refugees. They did not have the contacts with the army or the standing in Washington that the Joint had, and could not offer the long-term solution to the DP problem of resettlement in Palestine that the Jewish Agency offered. The one remaining field where the Congress had clear leadership role was the issue of reversing the economic damage done to the Jews by the Nazis. Excuse me. Here there were some successes. In the course of 1945, the State Department and the US Special Ambassador on Reparations, Edwin Pauley, met with Congress representatives to discuss including the Jews as beneficiaries of general reparations, above and beyond restitution. This was hugely significant, for it would have accorded to the Jews a status as an allied nation. In itself, a real achievement for the World Jewish Congress had it eventuated. In the policy papers that Ambassador Pauley presented to the State Department and to President Truman in July 1945, the language is clearly that of the World Jewish Congress and not of an American diplomat. I quote, "There is no machinery available to represent the hundreds of thousands of people who fought Hitler from the very beginning and who, after being robbed and looted by the Nazis, were made stateless." This is the language of a Jewish organization, not of the State Department. This empathetic introduction was not the usual language of the hard-headed policy framers in Washington. Pauley went on to suggest that 2% of the overall reparations be set aside for stateless victims of Nazism. As Pauley reported to the State Department, if the Jews were not given a source of funding for the task of rehabilitating the survivors, American and British taxpayers would end up footing the bill. This proposal was tentatively adopted by the State Department, possibly as a way of avoiding advancing a policy of property restitution, which would have made life awkward for them in occupied Germany. The Congress was on the verge of a signal achievement, but it was ultimately blocked by the British, who rejected the idea of the Jews receiving a piece of general reparations cake because they opposed any step that would strengthen the Jewish claim to recognition of nationhood, and because a resulting cash flow would increase the pressure on the British administration in Palestine by providing funds that would be used for illegal immigration and arms purchases for the Haganah. As a compromise between American and British interests and an alternative way of giving the Jews justice, the Reparations Conference held in Paris at the end of 1945 adopted the policy set out in Article 8 of the Final Act of Reparations. Specific funds would be set aside for the benefit of non-repatriable victims of Nazi persecution, largely a code phrase for Jews, from airless, presumably Jewish, deposits in Swiss banks, all non-monetary gold found in Germany, and 25 million from German assets in the neutral countries. This decision of the Allied Conference on Reparations was adopted in January 1946. The question now was which organization in the Jewish world would actually receive the funds that derived from the agreement. For reasons that I have explained elsewhere and are too detailed to recount here, the State Department recoiled from the idea of appointing the World Jewish Congress to that role. Instead, the Jewish Agency and the Joint were selected and were thereby effectively anointed to lead the political struggle that followed for the implementation of restitution, indemnifications, reparations agenda of the Jewish world. Blocking the Congress from engagement with the DP camps had a devastating impact on the organization as a whole. The Jewish world was overwhelmingly interested in two practical issues: the care and ultimate fate of the Holocaust survivors and the Yishuv's struggle for independence in Palestine. That the fact that the Congress was not directly involved in either issue greatly undercut its support in Jewish communities around the world. Its exclusion from the leadership role in the restitution and reparations process was potentially much worse and created a crisis of confidence within the organization as a whole. The conference had been effectively and terminally marginalized. In a series of meetings of senior officers held in 1946 and 1947, this crisis was openly discussed. Was the World Jewish Congress relevant anymore? It was made worse by the serious financial crisis caused by declining support from its constituency of Jewish communities. Nachum Goldman was not involved in the daily management of the conference. He was the president, but he wasn't involved. In fact, he was increasingly busy with other organizations. And senior members of the World Jewish Congress began to find employment elsewhere, usually in Palestine. Aria Tatakova left New York for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Aria Kerbovsky left for Israel in 1948 and joined the Israeli Foreign Office. Jacob Robinson joined the fledgling Israeli Foreign Office already in 1947. Stephen Wise, who had lent the Congress much prestige over the years, died in 1949. However, come to concluding remarks, despite the progressive marginalization of the Congress in the post-war years, the Institute for Jewish Affairs, which the Congress subsidized, paid for, played a very special role in the deliberations of the Jewish organizations. In 1947, Nehemiah Robinson became head of the Institute, and his expertise on spoliation and remedial action, the title of his most influential work, gave him a unique role in Jewish forums. He was the leading thinker on the subject and played a central role in formulating Jewish claims during the 1940s and 1950s. The Institute continued to publish books, pamphlets, and newsletters that reported on developments in Allied policy and progress on issues of restitution. He played a crucial role in coordinating between the different policy positions of the various Jewish organizations as demands for restitution, indemnification, and reparations evolved leading up to the negotiations in Wassenaar and the Luxembourg agreements. He advised both delegations, the Israeli and the Claims Conference, during the talks, and continued to monitor the restitution process, not only in Germany but throughout Europe until his death in 1964. He was not a politician, and others, in particular Nachum Goldman, have received the credit for the multifaceted process that contributed so much to the rebuilding of the Jewish world after the Holocaust. But much of that credit was due to Nehemiah Robinson, a dedicated civil servant of the Jewish world.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating opening, no doubt. Let me just add a point that the picture you have portrayed of the Allies and especially the British refusing or to accept or objecting the notion of Jewish peoplehood, and even after the Holocaust, continued in many directions. And if we take a look at the Nuremberg trials, in the Nuremberg trials, the Jewish people did not have a representation. We didn't have a state. There was no representation. The decision of the judges and the administrators of the Nuremberg trials was not to have testimonies, but to rely on documents. So there were no Jewish witnesses as well. And the Holocaust was not dealt with as a crime in itself. It appeared in many, in the commanders of the Kemp's trial, in the Einsatzgruppen trials, in others, but not in itself as a distinct a crime that should be punished for. So it was a whole, what you pointed out so eloquently, was a whole set of attitude to the Jewish people, even after the Holocaust. So thank you really.